10:47 a.m. Earl Thompson sat in his usual spot, a plastic chair beside the main entrance of Jefferson High School. His coffee had gone cold. His knees ached. His belly pressed against his belt. Just another Tuesday morning. The hallways buzzed with teenagers rushing to third period, their laughter echoing off the lockers, their eyes sliding past him like he was part of the furniture. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Soldier Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Earl was 62 years old, 127 kilos of what the students called waste of space. He had worked as a security guard at Jefferson High for 14 years, and in all that time, not a single person had asked him a meaningful question about his life. They saw the sweat stains under his arms. They saw the way he wheezed when he climbed stairs. They saw the cheap uniform that stretched too tight across his stomach. That was all they needed to see. "Hey fatso," a junior yelled as he sprinted past. "Someone steal your donut?" Laughter erupted from his friends. Earl smiled and said nothing. He had heard every variation of that joke for 14 years. He had learned that silence was easier than explanation, that invisibility was safer than being seen. But there were things about Earl Thompson that no one at Jefferson High knew. Things hidden in a locker that no one had ever opened. Things buried in a past that no one had ever asked about. And on his chest, pinned so small that it disappeared against his dark uniform, was a Purple Heart lapel pin that not a single student or teacher had ever noticed. The first clue was the locker itself. Earl kept it in the security office, a dented metal box with a combination lock that hadn't been changed since 1972. Inside was a world that didn't match the man everyone thought they knew. A folded American flag, triangle tight, with a small gold star pinned to the fabric. 3 medals in velvet cases, bronze star, silver star, Purple Heart, and a photograph, black and white, edges worn soft by decades of handling. The photograph showed a young man standing in front of a Huey helicopter, M16 rifle slung across his chest, jungle fatigue stained with mud and something darker. The man was lean, muscular, his jaw sharp, his eyes cold. He looked nothing like Earl Thompson. And yet, if you looked closely, if you really looked, the eyes were exactly the same. Calm, watchful. The eyes of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. Earl never opened that locker during school hours. He never spoke about Vietnam, never mentioned the 173rd Airborne Brigade, never explained why he sometimes woke up screaming in his empty apartment. He had buried that man 50 years ago, buried him in rice paddies and helicopter crashes and the faces of friends who never came home. But the man wasn't dead. He was just sleeping. The students had a nickname for him, Fat Earl, sometimes Fatso, sometimes worse. They made TikToks mocking his walk, his weight, his existence. One video had gone viral the previous year, a slow-motion clip of Earl bending over to pick up a dropped radio, his pants straining, set to circus music. 40,000 views. Comments filled with laughing emojis and cruel jokes. Earl had seen the video. Someone had shown him, expecting a reaction. He had smiled, nodded, and gone back to his plastic chair. What could he say? That 50 years ago, he had carried a wounded sergeant 3 miles through enemy territory with 2 bullets in his own leg? That he had received a silver star for single-handedly holding off a Viet Cong assault while his squad evacuated? That he had killed more men than these children had years on Earth? He couldn't say any of that, so he said nothing. The teachers were no better. They spoke about him in the teacher's lounge like he wasn't human, like he was a piece of furniture that had somehow developed hearing. "What's even the point of him?" the young history teacher, Mr. Davidson, asked one morning. He was 28, confident, the kind of man who had never faced anything harder than a student loan payment. If someone actually attacked this school, what's he going to do? Sit on them? Laughter filled the room. Earl was walking past the open door. He heard every word. He kept walking, his face unchanged, his heart rate steady. He had been insulted by drill sergeants, by enemy soldiers, by men who would have killed him if they could. A history teacher with soft hands and a sarcastic mouth didn't even register. But Earl remembered. He remembered everything. The second clue was his hands. If anyone had bothered to look closely, they would have noticed that Earl's hands didn't match his body. They were scarred, calloused, with knuckles that had clearly been broken multiple times. The hands of a fighter. The hands of a man who had done violence and survived it. But no one looked at Earl's hands. No one looked at Earl at all. Principal Morrison was polite but dismissive. She greeted him every morning with a "Good morning, Earl," that never waited for a response. She had inherited him from the previous administration and kept him because firing him would require paperwork she didn't want to do. In her mind, Earl was a checkbox. Security guard present? Yes. Effective? Who cares? Earl understood his role perfectly. He was there to make parents feel safe, to provide the illusion of security without the substance. A scarecrow in a uniform. A speed bump, not a wall. And he had accepted that role, had embraced his own invisibility, because invisibility was peaceful and peace was all he wanted after 50 years of war inside his own head. But peace, as Earl knew better than anyone, never lasted forever. The third clue was how Earl watched people. Not the lazy gaze of a bored security guard, but something sharper, more systematic. His eyes moved constantly, tracking movement, cataloging faces, noting exits and windows and angles of approach. It was unconscious now, muscle memory from a time when missing a detail meant death. He knew every student's routine. He knew that Marcus Wheeler always arrived late on Tuesdays because his mother worked night shifts. He knew that Emily Chin ate lunch alone in the library because the cafeteria gave her panic attacks. He knew that the side door near the gymnasium didn't lock properly and had reported it 6 times to maintenance with no result. He knew the building better than the principal, better than the teachers, better than the architects who had designed it. He had walked every hallway, tested every door, mapped every blind spot. Not because anyone asked him to, because that's what you did when you were responsible for lives. Even if no one knew you were responsible. Even if no one believed you were capable. The morning of October 17th started like any other. Earl arrived at 6:30 a.m., an hour before his shift, because he liked the silence of the empty building. He walked his route, checked his doors, nodded at the early bird janitor who was the only person in the school who ever called him by his actual name. Morning Earl. Morning Hector. That was the extent of their conversation, and it was enough. 2 men who understood that words were overrated. By 7:45, the buses were arriving. By 8:15, the hallways were chaos. By 10:30, Earl was in his plastic chair, watching the front entrance, sipping cold coffee, being invisible. At 10:41, a white sedan pulled into the visitor parking lot. Earl noticed it immediately. The car sat there for 6 minutes, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see inside. 6 minutes was too long. Visitors either parked and entered or realized they were at the wrong place and left. They didn't sit. Earl set down his coffee. His hand moved to his radio, then stopped. What would he say? There's a car in the parking lot? They would laugh at him. Again. Instead he stood. His knees protested, his back ached, but he stood, and he watched. At 10:47, the car door opened. The figure that emerged was wearing black. Black jacket, black pants, black mask, black gloves. And in his hands, black metal that Earl recognized instantly, that his body recognized before his mind could catch up. AR-15. Semi-automatic. 30-round magazine. Earl's heart rate didn't spike. His hands didn't shake. 50 years of civilian life fell away in a single second, and the man from the photograph, the man he had buried in rice paddies and nightmares, woke up. He was already moving. Not toward the entrance, that would be suicide, but toward the intercom panel on the wall. His fingers found the button, and his voice came out calm, steady, military. Lockdown. Active shooter approaching main entrance. This is not a drill. Lockdown now. The intercom crackled through every room in the building. For 1 second there was silence. Then chaos. Teachers who had mocked Earl for years suddenly did exactly what he said. Doors slammed. Locks clicked. Students who had made TikToks about his weight dropped to the floor and crawled under desks. In the span of 10 seconds, Jefferson High transformed from a school into a fortress. But the main entrance was glass, and Earl was standing right beside it. The shooter was 20 feet away now, walking with the calm determination of someone who had already accepted death. Earl could see his eyes through the mask. Young eyes, empty eyes, the eyes of someone who had decided that other people's lives were worth less than his own pain. Earl had seen eyes like that before. In the jungle. In the faces of men who had nothing left to lose. He had 10 seconds, maybe less. The glass doors would shatter. The shooter would enter. And then it would be a matter of mathematics. How many students could die before police arrived? Earl did the calculation in his head. Response time for local police, 8 to 12 minutes. Number of students in the building, 847. Number of rounds in a standard AR-15 magazine, 30. Time to reload, 3 seconds for someone practiced, 5 for someone nervous. The mathematics were unacceptable. Earl Thompson, 62 years old, 127 kilos, diabetic, arthritic, mocked and forgotten, made a decision. He stepped in front of the glass doors. The shooter stopped. He hadn't expected anyone to be standing there. He had expected screaming, running, the chaos of prey. Instead, he found a fat old man in a security uniform, blocking the entrance, arms at his sides, face completely calm. Don't do this, son. Earl's voice was quiet, conversational, the voice of a man discussing weather. Whatever's happened to you, this isn't the answer. The shooter raised his weapon. Move. No. I'll kill you. You might. Earl didn't move. But while you're killing me, you're not killing them. And that's the math I'm willing to do. For 3 seconds, neither man moved. The shooter's finger was on the trigger. Earl's hands were empty. It should have been over in a heartbeat. But Earl Thompson had spent 18 months in Vietnam learning to read men's eyes. He could see hesitation behind the mask. Not much, but enough. The shooter had planned for terror, not resistance. He had imagined screaming children, not a calm old man who seemed genuinely unafraid to die. "Who are you?" the shooter asked. Earl smiled. The same smile he had given to every student who mocked him, every teacher who dismissed him. The smile of a man with nothing left to prove. "Nobody important," he said. "Just the fat security guard." The shooter's eyes narrowed. His grip tightened, and Earl moved. 50 years had slowed his body, but they hadn't erased his training. The techniques were carved into his nervous system, etched there by drill sergeants in combat and the desperate need to survive. His left hand shot out, not to grab the weapon but to redirect it, to push the barrel 6 inches to the right. His right hand followed, palm-heel strike to the jaw, not hard enough to kill but hard enough to stun. The AR-15 fired. The bullet shattered a window to Earl's left, missing him by inches. But by then Earl had both hands on the weapon, twisting, leveraging, using the shooter's own momentum against him. The rifle clattered to the floor. Earl kicked it away and delivered a second strike, this one to the solar plexus. The shooter went down. Earl Thompson, breathing hard, knees screaming, heart pounding for the first time in years, stood over the man who had come to kill children. The whole encounter had lasted 11 seconds. He reached for his radio. Shooter neutralized. Main entrance. Send police and medical. Then he sat down. Not on his plastic chair that was too far away. Just on the floor, his back against the wall, his hands finally beginning to shake. The adrenaline was fading and in its place came pain. His knees, his back, his chest. The old wounds and the new exertion combining into something that felt a lot like dying. But he wasn't dying. He was just old. And tired. And finally, after 50 years, done hiding. The police arrived in 9 minutes. They found Earl still sitting against the wall, the shooter zip-tied with the man's own belt, the AR-15 unloaded and cleared, the building still in lockdown. They found 847 students and 63 staff members alive and unharmed. They found a hero. But they didn't understand what they had found. Not yet. The paramedics insisted on checking Earl. His blood pressure was elevated, his blood sugar was low, his knees were swollen. Normal for a man his age, abnormal for a man who had just disarmed an active shooter with techniques that hadn't been taught in security guard training. "Where did you learn to do that?" one paramedic asked, genuinely curious. Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something he hadn't said out loud in 50 years. 173rd Airborne Brigade, Vietnam, 1969 to 1971. The paramedic's eyes widened. "You're a veteran?" "I'm a security guard," Earl said. That's all anyone needed to know. The news crews arrived within the hour. By evening, Earl Thompson's face was on every channel, his story spreading across social media with the same velocity that had once spread mockery. The fat security guard. The hero. The man no one had seen. But the story they told was incomplete. They knew about the disarming, the lockdown, the 11 seconds that saved 847 lives. They didn't know about the locker. They didn't know about Vietnam. They didn't know about the 50 years of silence. That changed when Marcus Wheeler's mother came forward. Mrs. Wheeler had lost her brother in Vietnam, a helicopter pilot shot down over the Central Highlands in 1970. She had grown up with stories of the battle, of the rescue attempt, of the one soldier who had held off enemy forces long enough for wounded men to be evacuated. The soldier's name had been in her family's prayers for 50 years, Sergeant Earl Thompson, 173rd Airborne. She had never made the connection. How could she? The Earl Thompson in those stories was a warrior, a legend, a ghost from history. The Earl Thompson at her son's school was a fat old man in a cheap uniform. They couldn't possibly be the same person. Until she saw his face on the news. Until she looked into his eyes and recognized something her family had described for half a century. The calm, the stillness, the absolute absence of fear. She came to the hospital where Earl was being kept overnight for observation. She brought the letters her mother had saved, letters from the army describing her brother's final mission, letters that mentioned Sergeant Thompson by name. She found Earl alone in his room, staring out the window at nothing. "Sergeant Thompson?" she said from the doorway. Earl turned. No one had called him that in 50 years. "My name is Denise Wheeler," she said, her voice shaking. "My brother was Chief Warrant Officer Ronald Hayes. You saved his crew. In 1970, you held off the enemy while they evacuated the wounded. My brother died in that battle, but 4 of his men survived. Because of you." Earl's face didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Something cracked. "I remember Ronnie," he said quietly. "Good pilot, brave man. I'm sorry I couldn't save him too." The story broke wide open the next day. Reporters dug into Earl's military record and found a history that didn't match the man anyone thought they knew. 2 tours in Vietnam. Silver Star for gallantry. Bronze Star with valor. Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. A battlefield commission from enlisted to officer. One of the rarest honors in the military. Sergeant First Class Earl Thompson had been a legend in the 173rd Airborne. He had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, saved more lives than anyone could count, killed more enemy combatants than anyone wanted to count. He had been wounded 3 times and refused evacuation each time. He had been nominated for the Medal of Honor twice, denied both times due to insufficient documentation from missions that were still classified. And when he came home in 1971, he had disappeared. No parades, no recognition, no reintegration. Just a man who wanted to forget what he had done and what had been done to him. A man who gained weight and lost ambition and found a job where no one would ever look at him twice. For 50 years he had hidden in plain sight. A warrior disguised as a failure. A hero dressed as a joke. The students who had mocked him were devastated. The TikTok video was deleted, but screenshots survived, monuments to cruelty that now looked very different in context. Comments that had been funny were now evidence of blindness, of the human tendency to judge books by covers that tell nothing of the pages within. Mr. Davidson, the history teacher who had joked about Earl sitting on attackers, resigned 3 days later. His resignation letter was leaked to the press. It contained a single sentence: "I taught history for 6 years and never recognized it standing in front of me." Principal Morrison held a press conference where she praised Earl's heroism while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of how her school had treated him. Reporters noticed. The internet noticed. Her career would never fully recover. But Earl didn't care about any of that. He was still in the hospital, still staring out windows, still processing the fact that the wall he had built between his past and present had finally collapsed. The ceremony happened 2 weeks later, in the gymnasium of Jefferson High School. The same gymnasium where students had laughed at Earl, where teachers had ignored him, where he had stood invisible for 14 years. Now every seat was filled. Students sat in silence, many of them crying. Teachers stood along the walls, their faces marked with shame and gratitude in equal measure. Parents filled the back rows, holding photographs of children who had come home alive because of a man they had never bothered to know. On the stage sat a row of military officers in dress uniforms, more stars and medals than Jefferson High had ever seen. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs was there, along with 3 generals and a congressman who had served in Vietnam himself. Earl walked to the stage slowly, his knees still aching, his uniform traded for a suit that his sister had bought him 40 years ago and that somehow still fit. The applause started when he entered and didn't stop until he reached the podium. The oldest general, a 4-star named Harrison who had served in Earl's unit in Vietnam, approached the microphone first. 55 years ago, he said, "I was a scared young lieutenant in the Central Highlands. My platoon was pinned down, taking casualties, about to be overrun. And out of nowhere this sergeant appeared. No backup, no orders, just a man who saw soldiers in trouble and decided to do something about it." He paused, composing himself. Sergeant Thompson held that position for 6 hours. 6 hours, alone, with nothing but an M16 and a grenade launcher. When reinforcements finally arrived, he had 17 confirmed kills and wounds that should have been fatal. The medic who treated him said he had never seen anyone lose that much blood and stay conscious. Harrison turned to face Earl directly. "That man saved my life. He saved the lives of 11 other soldiers that day. And for 50 years he has refused every invitation to be honored, every attempt to recognize his service. He disappeared into civilian life and asked only to be left alone." He smiled a sad smile. "But then he went and saved 847 more lives. And this time we're not letting him disappear." The Secretary of Veterans Affairs stepped forward, holding a velvet box. "Earl Thompson," he said, his voice formal but warm, "by order of the President of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of your own life, above and beyond the call of duty." The gymnasium erupted. Students who had called him fatso leaped to their feet. Teachers who had questioned his usefulness wept openly. Parents clutched each other, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Earl stood frozen. The Medal of Honor, the highest award the nation could give, for actions 55 years old, finally acknowledged, finally seen. But the secretary wasn't finished. "Furthermore, in recognition of your actions on October 17th, which directly prevented the loss of hundreds of young lives, you are awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal, the highest honor a civilian can receive. 2 medals. 2 lifetimes of service. One man who had never asked for recognition, who had only asked to be useful, who had turned invisibility into armor and solitude into strength." Earl stepped to the microphone. The gymnasium fell silent. He looked out at the faces watching him, the children he had saved, the teachers who had dismissed him, the officers who had finally found him after 50 years of searching. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm just a man who made a decision. In Vietnam, I decided that my brothers' lives were worth more than my comfort. Last month, I decided the same thing about your children." He paused. "You want to honor me? Then see each other. Really see each other." The janitor, the lunch lady, the security guard, The people you walk past every day without a second glance. Everyone has a story. Everyone has fought battles you know nothing about. Everyone deserves to be seen. He touched the medals on his chest, the old ones and the new. I spent 50 years being invisible. And honestly, that was fine. But if my story makes one person look twice at someone they've been ignoring, then maybe being seen isn't so bad after all. The applause that followed was the loudest Jefferson High had ever heard. It went on for 7 full minutes. Students rushed the stage, not for selfies but for handshakes, for hugs, for the chance to look Earl Thompson in the eyes and say what they should have said years ago. Thank you. I'm sorry. I see you now. Earl accepted it all with the same quiet dignity he had carried for 62 years. He shook hands, patted shoulders, told crying teenagers that it was okay, that he forgave them, that the only thing that mattered was what happened next. When the ceremony ended, when the cameras left and the dignitaries departed, Earl Thompson walked out of Jefferson High School for the last time. Not because he was fired, but because he had finally finished the mission. He had spent 50 years protecting people who didn't know they were being protected. Now they knew. And that was enough. The next morning at 6:30 a.m., a new security guard arrived at Jefferson High. Young, fit, recently discharged from the Marines. He found a note waiting on the plastic chair by the main entrance, written in Earl's careful handwriting. Watch the side door near the gym. It doesn't lock properly. I reported it 6 times. Maybe they'll listen to you. The new guard smiled. Then he walked the building, checked every door and prepared to be invisible. Because that's what guardians do. Moral of the story, heroes don't need to be seen to serve, but everyone deserves to be seen. Look twice at the people you pass every day. Their story might save your life. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. Please subscribe for more soldier stories. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Stories that remind us of the quiet strength carried by those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.